Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 327. As mentioned in the previous Drydock, this month is a catch-up month, so the questions this week are taken from guides 400 and 401, that's to the ironclads HMS Alexandra and SMS Kaiser, the Wednesday videos on the rise of the Imperial German Navy and USS Silversides, and a Friday video on who won Midway, Admiral Fletcher or Admiral Spruance. So let's get on with questions. BK Zhang asks, was there any way the ironclad era could have gone without people building horrendously flawed ships based on quickly outmoded or outright non-viable ideas? Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, I don't think there's any way to avoid that entirely with the ironclad era, simply because technology was advancing at a truly phenomenal pace. I mean, we think that technology was moving quickly in the 1900s, 1910s, when you go from, pre-dreadnoughts in 1905 to super dreadnoughts by 1915, and you could probably shave a year or two off of either end of that. But in the ironclad era, technology was actually moving even faster than that, because ultimately, let's face it, when you look at, let's say, a Queen Elizabeth class super dreadnought or a South Carolina class, the USA's first dreadnought, what has really changed? Okay, the propulsion and fuel is a bit different. That's fair enough. It's bigger. And that's really about it in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, there's loads of small details, but in the end, they're both ships with 4 twin turrets, 2 super firing forward, 2 super firing aft, distributed armour scheme. Apart from the fact that Queen Elizabeths have turbine and oil instead of vertical triple expansions and coal, basically one is just a bigger version of the other with the details changed. Whereas when you look at the ironclad period from 1860 through to maybe around 1890, you can have multiple major changes in technology happening during the period in which a single ironclad vessel is being built. And we're not talking about it being built by somebody who takes half a decade or a decade to build the thing. Even when the French and the British are churning out ironclads left, right, and centre in 2-3 years, by the time a ship enters service, there may have been 2 or 3 advances in technology that, while not necessarily making that ship obsolete, although sometimes that did occur, they will at least have rendered the ship not actually cutting-edge state-of-the-art, even before it's first raised its commission flag. I mean, this is a period that sees you go from fire tube to water tube, basic steam engines, compound steam engines, double compound steam engines, vertical triple expansion steam engines. Armour goes from iron to compound to Harvey steel, and in some cases with an intervening nickel steel, and then Krupp steel. Although technically speaking, obviously the ironclad age technically ends when people start using Harvey steel. And in the, let's say, 1850s, there are shell guns and there are solid shotguns, but there's a fair number of 32-pounders in service that wouldn't look out of place on a Nelsonian battleship. And in the space of, a decade and a half, you go from that to guns that can fire shot and shell, armour-piercing shell. The weight of the guns and the weight of the shot gets considerably larger. They switch over from measuring guns by weight of shot to the weight of the gun itself because they're so massive. When Inflexible is being built, they go through 3 or 4 different potential iterations of her armament, and they end up stopping simply because the latest gun that's been developed while she's under construction is actually too big for her hull. Torpedoes become a thing, the turtleback armor deck becomes a thing, and that's just a sample of the successful technologies. So with all the speed that they're going at, and obviously that's not even mentioning things like quick-firing guns, you can theoretically build a navy that is entirely sort of wait and see what the latest technology is that actually works, and then build based on that. And when we're talking about technology, obviously those are all systems. We're also talking about hull design and that kind of stuff. But if you do that, so let's say you wait 2-3 years to see what stuff pans out, what stuff was actually not really particularly successful, then you build a ship that uses this proven technology. Well, by the time that those ships hit the water, it's now been 6 or 7 years since that technology was first available. And by that point, everybody else is going to be miles ahead, because anybody who's adopting the latest and greatest technology, yeah, they'll have a few failures here and there, but a lot of that stuff also works out. And so they'll have ships almost a decade ahead. And, well, 7, 8, 9, 10 years in the latter part of the 19th century is an absolutely huge difference. I mean, that's the difference between the last of the wooden ships converted to broadside ironclads in the Royal Navy and the HMS Devastation type vessel. But of course, if you're at the leading edge of technology, you don't necessarily know which ones are going to work out. So I'm afraid, I think at that point, yeah, there's maybe a few that with a little bit of thinking could have been avoided, but for the most part, there were going to be a fair number of technologies implemented on full-scale warships that actually didn't really pan out all that well, simply because it was a kind of use it or lose it situation. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, did anyone of the ironclad period, when sails were still used, try to get around the spark problem by placing the funnel in an unconventional spot, in a similar vein to how early aircraft carriers like Akagi and Kaga tried to get the smoke to not hinder visibility of the flight deck? Was this ever thought of or even tried? I'm not aware of anyone really trying it on any kind of significant scale. The main solution was just don't have sails, which obviously did get implemented relatively quickly, at least on coastal defense vessels, and in some cases, like with the Devastations, on actual full-scale warships. The fundamental problem is that given the size of boilers, they pretty much have to be placed, approximately speaking, amidships, because that's where the ship is widest, that's where you can fit them and the fuel that you need to go in them. And under most, not all, but most circumstances, you have to have the engines then behind them, unless you like really, really, really long propeller shafts. And so that means that unless there's a very, 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 very pressing reason not to do so, typically your funnels are going to come up essentially dead amidships, or a little bit forward or back from there, usually a little bit forward. That in turn runs into another issue, which is that similarly, you can't really put masts absolutely anywhere you want. You can't put masts too far forward or too far back, otherwise bad things are going to happen to both the mast and the ship. And you can't put masts too close together, otherwise you'll end up with the sails interfering with each other, either directly or through stolen wind. And that means that if you're going to have enough masts, and therefore enough sails, to actually propel the ship when you're not using the funnels, you can only play around with the location of the masts enough to get them immediately clear of the funnels, but that's really about it. At which point the only really optimal solutions are just to not deploy the sails that are immediately after the funnels, if that's a problem. And you will actually see this on a number of ironclads when they're under steam and sail. Very often they'll have the two largest sails on the main mast, which you can see here is obviously the central mast, directly behind the funnels. They'll often have those furled, even although the rest might be deployed. But the other thing you've actually got to remember is that if you're operating under both sail and steam simultaneously, then under most circumstances, the wind is going to be somewhere in your aft quarters. And that means the wind is going to be blowing from stern to bow, because that's how it's filling the sails. And that in turn means, unless you're moving at a real clip, which is relatively unlikely with the kind of ships we're talking about, there's a very high chance that any smoke and embers being emitted from your funnels might actually be being blown forwards rather than aft. Because, yeah, you might be moving forward at 12 knots, but how fast is the wind coming behind you that's pushing the sails going? If it's going 20, 30 knots, well, you might actually have to start worrying about the forward sails rather than your main sails, at which point it suddenly becomes all that much clearer why the foremast seems to be the thing that edges away from the funnels the most as compared to the mainmast in a lot of ironclads that have full rigging as well. Treyan Doss asks, I recently finished The Wager by David Gran, and early in the book he describes the dangers involved with climbing up and working on the rigging. Did any navy of the era the channel covers keep records of deaths related directly to accidents in the rigging? Yes and no. No, in the sense that I'm not aware of any navy that had a specific set of records that was just sailors which died above decks while they were working on the sails, the masts, the yardarms, the rigging, etc., etc. But yes, in the sense that pretty much on every ship in every navy, if somebody died aboard the ship, whether it be through enemy action or misadventure, the captain was under duty to record exactly what happened to them and why in a reasonable amount of detail. Now, what the Navy thought was a reasonable amount of detail might admittedly amount to only a few sentences, but they still had to be sentences that explained what exactly had happened, partly because obviously someone had died, and if there was a common and obvious theme of this thing keeps happening, then maybe we should do something about it, because sailors take a while to train. They're not exactly cheap. I mean, okay, in the age of sail, they're a little bit cheaper than they would be these days, but an experienced sailor getting themselves killed is still not something you really want to happen. And, of course, it means that there's hopefully no suggestion of foul play. And so when you go through the books of various ships, if somebody is killed, it will usually tell you why. Now, granted, sometimes that can be relatively brief and unhelpful, but that's usually during battles. So you might see so-and-so died of wounds occurred in battle. Well, okay, yeah, so he was wounded in some manner during a fight. That doesn't tell you all that much. Then, of course, you might also have someone who will say, this person died because a cannonball hit him and took his head off. Well, yeah, that'll usually kill you. But if you like peacetime accidents, the ship might be at war, but non-battle related accidents will generally merit a little bit more written about them, mostly because they're fairly unique. Whereas, in a battle, you might be having to write up summaries of why 24 men died and twice that many were wounded. If some guy has, slipped and fallen off of a yard, or he's actually, through no fault of his own, maybe been working his way along a yard to try and furl a sail, and the rope that he's been standing on has snapped, or the wind has gotten up and blown someone out of a crow's nest, or someone's just been hit by a traversing sail that went the wrong way and therefore knocked off into the sea, or anything like that, it will usually say. So while they're not all collated in one place, you can actually go through the ship's records and start to work out how many people on a typical voyage would die by accident, and also where would they die, what were the causes of their deaths, and where the patterns emerge. Vicky asks, for a battleship, is having a citadel too small to keep the ship afloat on its own really a disadvantage? Minimizing the size of the citadel does allow for the thickest possible belt and deck armour, or alternatively, for armour weight to be minimized while maintaining thickness, thus freeing up displacement for more machinery or more guns, as seen with the London Treaty era designs for the Congo replacements. While a larger citadel might technically allow a ship to remain afloat even if its ends are riddled and flooded, this sort of damage will still make the ship massively slow and potentially leave it a sitting duck for a coup de grace at leisure. And making the citadel larger requires either having thinner armour, increasing the risk of critical hits to the citadel, or a sacrifice of machinery or armament, making the ship offensively weaker and thus giving its opponents more chances. So does losing the theoretical, as mentioned above, ability to survive with the rest of the ship completely riddled and flooded really outweigh the increase in your ability to take down your opponents while no-selling would-be critical hits? That's actually a very good question, and perhaps one I'll do a Friday video about in more detail at some point. And indeed, some navies at points decided that perhaps it was something that could be sacrificed, because although the general rule of thumb was that the citadel should try and keep your ship afloat even if everything else was flooded, not every ship actually had that. Some ships, the designers compromised and said, you know what, we're actually willing to take that risk in exchange for something else. Bismarck being a good example of that. But here's a few problems with having an, let's say, undersized citadel. Yes, making the citadel smaller would save weight, and in theory that could allow you to fit bigger guns and more machinery. The problem is that the citadel typically doesn't actually cover much more than the guns and the machinery, which means that if you make the citadel small and you try and put the saved weight into more machinery, well, now the machinery space is larger, which means if you want the citadel to continue to cover the machinery, you have to make the citadel bigger, and now the ship is heavier than it was to start with. You'll note that, for example, with the Congo-class replacement designs that you mentioned, part of the weight saving was achieved not just by compacting everything really tightly together, but also by essentially chamfering the citadel so that you didn't have to have as much deck armour, which adds up to quite a lot of weight. The next problem is, of course, if you do bunch everything really, really close together in order to minimise your citadel, there is still a chance that somebody might get a hit in that compromises that citadel in one way, shape or form. And if everything is hyper-compact, then there is essentially zero chance of that hit that might make it through affecting something really, really important. Whereas with more usual citadel layouts, while they are still not really wasting all that much in terms of space, there is at least, a distance, for example, between barbettes, so that a shell hit, like in this case to HMS Barham, a shell hit that landed aft of the start of a turret barbette but forward of the bridge superstructure on Barham, there is a small but non-zero chance that that shell might detonate between the barbettes rather than on contact with one or the other of them, which of course is a potentially better outcome. So you are slightly increasing the chances of a critical hit if it bypasses your armour. Another problem, and probably one of the larger ones which dominated a lot of designers' thinking, is not necessarily it being all about the battleship's main guns. Battleships, of course, have secondary batteries, and other ships that might be nearby, like heavy cruisers and light cruisers, or maybe even ambitious destroyers, also have their own guns. Now, none of those guns, whether they be 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, etc., will be able to get through the citadel of either type of ship, either the more standard citadel or the hyper-compact citadel. But they can get through, in the case of distributed armour schemes, the minimally armoured, potentially, or in the case of all or nothing, which is more of what you're kind of envisaging, definitely the unarmoured portions of a ship. And the same goes for near misses by bombs and so on and so forth. And that potentially is a major issue, because if you're fighting another battleship one-on-one, great, but how many times is that actually likely to happen? It's very likely, especially if you're on the side that's potentially getting hit a lot, that the enemy has a bunch of escorts with them. Like, everyone talks about Rodney and King George V versus Bismarck, but a lot of people tend to miss out that there were a few heavy cruisers there as well. The same thing, Duke of York versus Scharnhorst. but also Norfolk, Belfast, Jamaica, and so many destroyers, and Sheffield for that matter as well, etc., etc. If you make your citadel unable to keep your ship afloat, then theoretically, even if you're actually winning or score drawing with another capital unit, other smaller vessels or the enemy capital unit secondary battery could still put you in a sinking condition through sheer weight of fire, poking holes in the unprotected portions of the ship, without ever having to worry about breaching that super strong citadel, at which point you now find yourself in a losing situation. And of course, the greater the portion of your ship that is unarmoured, the greater the chances of either hits or near misses with whatever caliber, putting nice big holes in that section, and then you have flooding, and not only can that be fatal in the longer term, in the more immediate term, by having more areas exposed to flooding and less able to resist it, you increase the chances of potentially developing quite a significant list one way or the other, which will actually impair you quicker than if you had a larger citadel. Because yes, if in a conventional citadel your ends are riddled and your ship is still afloat, you are a little bit of a sitting duck, but hopefully you're still able to fight back. Whereas if you put yourself in the same situation with a ship with a hypercompact citadel, you are now actually either sinking or sunk. And that's a lot worse of a condition to be in. And you might, even if you're not necessarily sinking right at that moment, you might have so much flooding that you can't bring your guns to bear on the direction of which everyone's shooting at you in. Now, of course, that does have to be moderated by the fact that, as you mentioned, the bigger citadel does cost you more in terms of weight. And ultimately, a citadel that's big enough to keep you afloat but is perhaps not strong enough to actually keep out the shells is not really a citadel at all. But this is why it's only the case that most of the time people went for a conventional type citadel, whereas some of the time it was, as we said at the beginning, a sacrifice people were willing to make to try and gain something elsewhere. C. Babylon asks, I've noticed that all of the 1800s era German ships in the rise of the Imperial German Navy seem to be quite elegant and very pleasing to the eye. In your opinion, which one did you find to be the most elegant? If I had to go with any one of the late 1800, early 1900s German ships, purely from an aesthetic perspective, it would be a very difficult choice. But one of the things I like about that line in terms of aesthetics for the period is this kind of what I'm going to call a double recurve bow, so where you've got a very visible ram bow going down below the water, but then rather than just continuing to rake back or coming up into a straight stem, the bow actually doubles back on itself and then flares out again up top. There's something about that which is kind of a combination of, yes, the ram bow showing this is very definitely a ironclad - early steel era ship, but then with that pointing overhang above, which also suggests both a hint of modernity, because that kind of forward flare is what you'll see in later ships into World War II, but also harkens back to the Age of Sail, when that's kind of the default bow shape. And then of the ships that the Germans build that display that, although it's not quite as, shall we say, extravagant in this nature as some of the others, I think I would then have to pick one of their early armoured cruisers, the SMS First Bismarck, which you can see here, because it combines that bow with a fairly sleek and, relatively speaking, especially for the time period, uncluttered appearance. Some of the German pre-dreadnoughts that have this kind of bow, for instance, do look a little bit too cluttered amidships. And also, there's just something about the shape of that forward superstructure, which it looks very, if you like, diesel punk-esque. It gives this really interesting blend of some elements being clean and futuristic and fairly monolithic, while at the same time also looking very industrial and having just that hint and tint of late 19th century elegance as well. So, yeah, I think First Bismarck would be the most elegant of the German 1800s - early 1900s ships for me. SV Lovecraft asks, I've always wondered, on the topic of the Battle of Jutland, do you believe, based on the number of hits, the locations of the hits, and the general course of events, that the English would have been better off at Jutland with smaller main guns, say 11-inch or essentially equivalent to most of the Germans, but with reliable fuses, or were the hits that took place and the higher levels of damage done per shot worth the generally poor quality fuses, i.e. would the Navy have been better off trading this with smaller main batteries, hypothetically with a smaller diameter, but it getting better shells in exchange? I think there would definitely be a case to say that the Royal Navy would have been better off using slightly smaller guns if they could guarantee that the fuses worked properly. However, I wouldn't go as far down as 11-inch, i.e. basically equivalent to things like the Nassaus and most of the German battlecruisers, partly because it would leave the Royal Navy at a simple disadvantage because everything from the Helgolands on in terms of battleships and the Der Flingers in terms of the battlecruisers on the German side would have 12-inch guns, but also the 11-inch by the time of Jutland, given the battle ranges involved and so forth, was probably not the best thing to have around. Now, granted, yes, of course, there were ships that were hit by 11-inch guns and suffered very badly for it, like the Indefatigable. However, once you get up to the scale of any ship that actually had any significant serious level of armouring for a capital ship engagement, the 11-inch, even obviously the German ones, did show itself to be a little too small, because there are 11-inch direct hits on 9-inch plate on some of the British battlecruisers that just do not make it through. The armour rejects the shell pretty much wholesale. And given that on average there was a little bit more belt armour on German ships than their equivalent British opposite numbers, a British fleet armed primarily with 11-inch shells, no matter how good their fuses were, would struggle to do any significant damage to the armoured portions of German ships. And when it comes to hitting the unarmoured or lightly armoured portions, even the malfunctioning fuses did perfectly fine because, well, the shell either went through the ship or the shell exploded shortly after going through the ship. That wasn't really too much of a problem. The bigger problem was when the shells hit the thickly armoured portions and detonated prematurely, at which point having a 15-inch shell with all that kinetic energy hitting and detonating prematurely and maybe staving in a plate is probably actually a better result than an 11-inch shell hitting that same plate with the fuse working perfectly, but the plate just going, yeah, whatever, no, and rejecting the shell outright. But if you wanted to do a kind of maybe a halfway house where, let's say, the Queen Elizabeths had 13.5-inch instead of 15-inch guns, but fully working shells, and the 13.5-inch ships had, let's say, 12-inch 50 caliber guns with working shells, and at that point, hopefully, the accuracy issues also fixed, that might do considerably more damage, because that would still leave you with enough armor penetration capability to at least theoretically get through most of the German battleship and battlecruiser protection. And then, of course, the working shells mean you actually will do damage once you get there. Tyler Kenza asks, I just picked up my copy of Shattered Sword this week, and in the opening chapter it mentions how Akagi and Kaga started with triple flight decks before being transformed into long single flight deck carriers. How would this work in theory, and could triple deck carriers have been improved upon? So the idea was that, as originally converted, Akagi and Kaga were double hanger carriers. So each of the lower flight decks was connected to one of those hangars. The lowest flight deck was connected obviously directly to the lower hangar, so you could just roll aircraft straight out onto it. The middle flight deck, as well as being the shortest one, has always been a little bit of a puzzle, because not only have you got a pair of 8-inch gun turrets in the way, as you can see, but also directly under the primary flight deck up top is where you would find the ship's bridge. So quite how you were expecting to get aircraft down there was questionable at best, I mean, in theory, if you had a folded wing aircraft, there might have possibly been a way of shuffling them past the bridge and then around the back of the turrets, although I've not seen that myself because I haven't had access to extremely detailed blueprints of the original format of a Karga and Karga. You could also, in theory, in preparation, run an aircraft or a few down from the primary flight deck and then use a crane or something to drop them down on there. Whatever, that was the general idea. So, as originally planned, it was thought that fighters and or recon aircraft could launch from the second flight deck. Torpedo bombers would launch from the lowest flight deck, and then anything else, so presumably level bombers or more fighters, could launch from the upper flight deck. And bearing in mind, dive bombers weren't yet quite a thing. And then it also would mean that when the ship was landing aircraft, you could actually continue to launch aircraft from the lower of two flight decks. And it would, in theory, also make launches a little bit faster, since once you'd prepped the aircraft in the hangar, you could just roll it straight out for launch rather than having to wait for a lift to cycle, or an elevator if you're American. Now, what happened, at least as far as most of the more detailed articles that even bother to cover these flight decks tend to mention, is that very quickly it became apparent that with a rapid increase in size and weight, and therefore takeoff length required for carrier-borne aircraft, the lowest of the flight decks, the one connected to the lower hangar, was only really practical for use by fighters, not torpedo bombers, which meant the bigger and heavier torpedo bombers had to then take off from the upper flight deck. And then the little dinky one in the middle, depending on which source you read, either was used for a few little bits of testing right at the start and then not at all, or was occasionally used for the launch of lightweight reconnaissance aircraft, or maybe the occasional single fighter, and that was about it. It doesn't seem to have been very heavily used much anyway. And then, of course, they decided the whole thing was a bit silly, and they went away with the conversion of both carriers into single flight deck carriers, which obviously then had more hangar space because the area forward could be taken up with hangars, and of course with a greater flight deck area, the newer, heavier, faster, etc. carrier strike aircraft could also still make use of the carrier. Now, could they have been improved upon? Well, in theory, the idea of either being able to launch multiple aircraft at a time from different flight decks and or continue to launch aircraft while you're undertaking recovery operations has a certain degree of merit to it. The problem that the Japanese faced, as well as the British later on, was pretty much all the things I just mentioned. Primarily the increase in takeoff speed and therefore flight deck length as newer and heavier aircraft came in. So ultimately, you can't really improve on it without doing something really weird. The funny part is that in its original format, as you can tell, Akagi and Kaga didn't have islands. If they had, and the bridge was then relocated to that island, then there would have been more direct and easier access from the upper hangar deck to the small flight deck in the middle, which might have marginally increased its utility. But the fundamental problem is that if you are taking off from inside the hangar, there is a slight uncertainty as to when your aircraft is actually going to get airborne, which is going to be partially dependent on when the pilot pulls the stick back, how much fuel is aboard, therefore how much does the aircraft weigh, and related to that, what kind of weaponry is it carrying, how fast is the ship going, what direction is the wind in, etc., etc. Which is why you have this stepped arrangement, because then when the aircraft either gets out into the clear or starts out in the clear, if it pulls up, it's not going to smash into the ceiling of the flight deck above it. And ultimately, because you want as much hangar space as you can get, and you want as long a flight deck as you can get for your upper flight deck, That means if the upper flight deck's running the full length of the ship, well, now your lower flight decks are facing that exact problem of, well, where's the aircraft going to go once it starts climbing? Plus, having the lowest flight deck also theoretically means there's more risk of water coming over the bows and then potentially entering the lower hangar deck, which, by converting it into a single flight deck carrier, you could ameliorate by plating in the bow. Now, the Japanese didn't actually end up doing that on Akagi and Kaga, but it's potentially a problem. But in terms of could you improve upon it in principle, I think yes, but not with retaining the full triple layout, because you really want as much hangar space as you can. So that means you are going to really want to expand the hangar space forward. You're going to want to make the upper flight deck run all the way forward. But to solve the problem of we don't know exactly when this aircraft is going to take off, and therefore there is a chance it might hit the flight deck above it, the solution might be, if you really, really, really want to keep at least the idea going, to either eliminate the intermediate, the smallest of the flying off decks entirely, if you want to keep the double hangar layout, or if you're converting it into a big single hangar layout, well, then there's just the one, which would be the lowest one. Either way, you're retaining the upper flight deck and the lower flight deck. You extend the upper flight deck near enough as they would do historically with Akagi and Kaga, but then on the lower flight deck, which would not necessarily entirely be retained, because obviously you've advanced the hangar forward, but you would have your hangar doors and then a very short flight deck leading out into the open. Now, you might have to play around with the structure or exact placement of the supports for the upper flight deck. As you can see here, this is what Akagi's bow looks like after her refit. So you want to make that lower section as wide as you can to obviously fit the wingspan of the aircraft you're launching. But then what I would do is have catapults. Now, of course, before the end of World War II, these aren't going to be steam catapults, because that is immediately post-war innovation. But you could have compressed air, hydraulic or gunpowder powered catapults, all of which were completely valid and proven into war technologies. Maybe just have the one. The main thing would be to have it quickly reloadable. So perhaps you would have two running very close together. You couldn't necessarily use both at once, but you could use one and then set up the other one ready to go while the first one was, if in the case of a hydraulic or compressed air one, recharging, or in the case of a gunpowder one, potentially you were preparing the reload. But in any case, that would obviously have the aircraft with a fixed known run up to flight, and it would be held on to the catapult rail up to a certain point. So that would largely mitigate the problem of the aircraft randomly soaring skyward when you didn't want it to. And the fact you're using the lowest position and the uppermost position for your flight deck also gives you a little bit of headroom there. That, I think, is probably about the only way you could still have a multiple flight deck launch system on a carrier in the 1930s or 1940s going forward, and have it be in any way potentially described as reasonably successful. And at that point also you'd probably have it rigged just for fighters, because that would then allow you to use your upper flight deck for your bigger, heavier strike aircraft, which need a longer takeoff run. You can then launch your fighters separately from beneath, and your fighters theoretically will have better climb performance, so launching from a bit low down shouldn't be too much of a problem for them. And it still gives you the capability, as mentioned previously, of being able to operate a certain number of aircraft while recovering others. So maybe you build enough capacity into those catapults to launch strike aircraft as well, although that would complicate things a bit. But it would at least mean that regardless of what your carrier is doing, you can always launch fighters to either become a combat air patrol or reinforce an existing one should the need arise, like, say, if a bunch of unexpected Dauntlesses show up. Frankenspank asks, compared to U-505, what were the main differences you noticed easily aboard USS Silversides? Is one larger or less cramped than the other? And which one would you rather serve on? Oh, I'd definitely prefer to serve aboard Silversides. Apart from obviously being on the slightly less genocidal side of the war. If I was forced to choose between the two, the other thing is, of course, Silversides has ice cream aboard. Or at least it does right up and once you've managed to steal one. An ice cream maker, that is. Whereas, yeah, U555, I don't like sauerkraut at the best of times. But one thing that is immediately apparent if you visit both, and obviously I visited one day and the other the next, so it's even more so apparent at that point, is that the US sub, the Silversides, is massively more roomy inside. Now, that might come as a surprise to those of you who have perhaps only been aboard a Gator or a Palau or something like that, and you think, well, it's a pretty small, pretty cramped sub. Compared to a modern sub, yes, it is. And, well, compared to even a small apartment in anywhere other than central New York or central London, yes, it is. Although I think interior the size of Silversides, you could probably split into 4 or 5 separate apartments and all charge ridiculous amounts for accommodation in each in aforementioned city centres. Never mind. But all these things are relative. And if you go aboard U505 in proximity to going aboard Silversides, which is the closest of the US fleet subs, or indeed if you're in the UK and hopefully in the future you'll be able to visit U534 and then head across the Atlantic to see one of the US fleet subs, you will notice the extreme difference. While getting down through Silversides can occasionally be a little bit of a challenge if you've got somebody coming the other way, for example, on U505, if someone's coming the other way, well, unless you're both, 5'5" and 100 pounds soaking wet, you ain't getting past each other. And similarly, when you're going down Silversides, there are bits to either side. There's an entire wardroom. Small, but there is one. There's a whole section of dedicated crew accommodation. There's enough space in the control room for a reasonable number of people. If you go on U505 or any other similar Type 9, and bearing in mind the Type 9 is the bigger of the two German submarines, that is the backbone of the Kriegsmarine during most of the Second World War, yeah, that space doesn't exist. I mean, on 505, they've actually taken steps, including removing some of the original deck plating, to make the ship more accessible and less claustrophobic, and it is still quite cramped. I mean, heck, Silversides even has a proper galley. Again, it's small, but it is a proper own little compartment, whereas on 505, the galley is essentially a bunch of equipment tucked into one corner of a very, very small compartment which has several other purposes. Or to put it another way, if you showed me around an American fleet boat and said, okay, well, compared to service on a surface ship, we want you to go here, what enticements are necessary, or these are the enticements we're offering you to go down there, well, slightly better food and an ice cream machine, and I'd be like, yeah, okay, I can probably live with that for a few months. Whereas if you took me on U505 and said, okay, what incentives do you require to serve on this thing for 2 or 3 patrols, my list of demands would have been a lot higher. A.B. Coates asks, what are some of the dumbest decisions made by smart captains or admirals who really should have known better? Oh, there's a lot of them. Now, the sinking of HMS Victoria by HMS Camperdown is something that's often cited as this generally. As you may know from various other times I've mentioned this, I'm not entirely in agreement with the assessment that Admiral Tryon was completely dumb in the orders that he gave. I think there are a lot of good reasons for what he was trying to do. It obviously didn't work out very well for him, but that's all for a video on the sinking, which I'll do at some point in the future. But there is a point, a slight spoiler alert, there is a point during the whole procedure where I think it went over from risky but, had good intentions to now this is getting a bit dumb. And it literally is just a matter of timing, because it became clear at the very last minute to everybody that a collision was imminent. However, once Tryon had hoisted his original signal and then the ship started to maneuver, realistically there should have been, and it seems from the way the signals were being exchanged, that a few minutes before the collision it was clear that something was not going quite to plan. At that point, I think Tryon should have gone, okay, clearly they haven't really got the idea, they're not doing it properly, we're going to order them to break it off, and we're just going to abandon this procedure. Maybe explain it to them in a bit more detail and try again, because this is getting dangerous. Instead, he seems to have tried to sort of cajole and get the other officers to infer what he wanted, and essentially he held out for too long under faith that people would realise what he wanted them to do, which, as it turned out, was a little bit of a dumb move. More collectively, another one that always makes me giggle slightly when I come across it at various points in Age of Sail history are the various French attempts to distract the British by causing an uprising reinforced with their own troops and ships in Ireland. Now, granted, given the way that the Irish people were historically treated, it's understandable they wouldn't need too much of a poke to try and rise up and kill a lot of British people in Ireland at various points. However, the French attempts, and there were quite a few of them, to do so, or to get the Irish to rise up and actually have their rising succeed by, giving them arms and actual experienced troops rather than just a bunch of angry locals charging people who had actual guns and actual training, always end up going horribly wrong. About the closest they got was the Jacobite uprisings in the late 1600s, and A, that still ended badly, and B, it only really got about as far as it did was because there was a deposed British king coming in rather than the French just saying, hey, go kill a bunch of British people. Storms, bad weather, and incidentally the Royal Navy, although it was mostly the storms and bad weather, constantly messed up the plans of the French to try and do this. So, it's understandable to try it once or twice, but to keep trying it over and over and over and over again, at that point what's going to happen. Age of Sail shipping technology hasn't advanced that dramatically. The wind and the weather are going to smash up your ships and drive you off and basically render the whole thing an expensive farce. And even if you do manage to get people ashore, as it turns out, while there are a large number of Irish people who are quite happy to find the nearest redcoat and have a go at them with a shillelagh, there's a lot of other Irish people who aren't quite so keen on the idea. And even when Irish uprisings do end up occurring in some way, shape or form, it's usually a case of, the other half of Ireland, and it's like, oh, right, here's an excuse to stick it to those guys down the street that we don't like. So, it's just a terrible idea overall, and I don't know why they kept doing it, but lots of French captains and admirals thought it was a brilliant idea. Primarch 359 says, I've been almost constantly listening to the Longest John's covering of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald recently, since its anniversary, and noted that the old cook said that it was too rough to feed people when the weather got really bad. Would the crew at least have been given sandwiches or other cold menu items? How were sailors fed when the seas got too rough? I assume it was similar for both merchant and naval sailors. It does actually depend a little bit, because merchant ships tend to have a relatively small crew compared to a warship, and therefore, theoretically, merchant ships could provide their sailors with hot meals, in slightly worse sea conditions than full-scale warships. Now, of course, a really big warship like a battleship or a carrier might stay more stable in rougher weather anyway, and thus be able to serve hot food in considerably worse conditions than a destroyer. But more generally, obviously, if you're cooking for several hundred or a couple of thousand people, that means you need quite a lot of equipment, quite a prolonged cooking time, quite a number of people, and a lot of food being processed. And that is exponentially more difficult than maybe cooking for a couple of dozen people, which could be done in a much smaller, much more confined environment. But while those differences between the merchant and warship sides of things do exist, more generally speaking, if the seas got too rough, the normal procedure was, cold menu items. For example, the crew of HMS Rodney during the chase after Bismarck, in the last stages before they closed in and opened fire, Rodney was pounding its way through some quite heavy seas, and it was noted that it was actually too heavy seas for the galley to run, and the crew spent essentially 24 hours, also locked up at action stations, but essentially being fed things like corned beef sandwiches and hot cups of tea, because you could still run the kettles, so you could give people hot drinks, but you weren't going to be able to prepare large amounts of hot food. But yeah, you could still prepare a cold sandwich in almost any weather. And in those cases, actually, the larger crew size and therefore larger galley crew of a warship might actually come back round and be an advantage, because let's say you're trying to prepare a corned beef sandwich, you can have, one person who's either strapped him or tied himself to a table, and his entire job is to, if the bread isn't sliced, slice bread. Then another person whose entire job is to put butter or some other kind of spread on it. Another person who's sorting out the corned beef, and another person whose job it is to take the slices of corned beef and form up the sandwiches. So essentially, as you're assembly lining it, each person has one task to do, and everything that's not focused on that one particular task they can use to keep themselves upright and in place. Whereas on a small merchant vessel, or even a medium merchant vessel, where you might only have a cook, or maybe a cook and an assistant, if he's got to do all of that at once, the same sea conditions might actually be too rough for him to do all those tasks together and constantly be switching back and forth between them all. Tankodromis asks, how much speed could be gained if the Nelson class were 8-gun ships, with B turret, the super firing one, being a twin? This could shorten the Citadel and mean less weight in the barbette. What would be the disadvantages of this layout? Well, in the grand scheme of things, the disadvantage would obviously be one less gun and slightly more complicated maintenance, because you'd have to have parts for the twin turret and other parts for the two triples, and you wouldn't save a huge amount of space. I mean, yes, in theory, the twin gun barbette would be a little bit smaller, so if you had its front at the same relative position as B turret was historically, then you could move C turret a little bit further forward, which would then give you a little bit more space in the machinery rooms, but you're talking a matter of a few more feet rather than anything particularly dramatic. So you might make the engine rooms a little bit more spacious, but probably not really giving you the space to stick extra boilers, for example. And we're not even going to touch on the amount of rebalancing you'd have to do in any case, because you'd also obviously have to shift the superstructure forward a little bit if you wanted to expand the boiler rooms and so forth. You would, granted, save several hundred tons of weight. That would probably help quite a bit. Then, of course, you have the added fun that because of the way they're laid out, unlike most ships, the Nelsons have their engine rooms forward of the boiler rooms. So anything you do that moves the machinery space further forward to take up the space that you've saved by having a twin turret means you're also going to have even longer propeller shafts. But if you're willing to play ball with that, then I would suggest perhaps with a slight modification, you might be able to squeeze in another pair of boilers. So, okay, we do the twin turret for B turret. and we move C turret, let's call it, further forward, and shift the superstructure further forward as well, because why not? But if at the same time we also remove the conning tower and its associated paraphernalia, which, let's face it, the British would do with their next class of battleship anyway, which allows us to bring the superstructure even further forward and frees up some of the compartment space below the main armour deck, aft of the last turret's magazines, but forward of the engine rooms. That might then allow us to also shift the fire control room, etc., forward partly into the space vacated by having the smaller magazines and shell rooms and smaller barbette. And then, if we use the fact that we've shifted everything forward slightly, and we're probably going to have 2 funnels now because there'd be too many boilers, but use the expanded space aft to rearrange where the rangefinder systems and mast is, to move one of the twin 6-inch to a midships, so you now only have 5 twin 6-inch, which will then allow you to obviously reposition the 2 remaining wing-mounted twins on either side and slightly reduce the overall size of the 6-inch magazine and shell room, which is at the other end of the machinery. Then collectively, I think that might just buy you enough space to get an additional pair of boilers in. And that, in theory, should give you just over 56,000 horsepower in your power plant. Now, given that Nelson and Rodney on their trials managed to achieve almost 24 knots on just under 46,000 shaft horsepower with a power plant that was designed for 45,000, I think you'd end up with a ship that would very comfortably hit 24 knots, might even be able to actually make 25, possibly, with that amount of power. I mean, obviously you'd have to do a lot more detailed calculations to work out exactly where it goes, but I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere between 24 and 25 knots was entirely on the table. Jim Smitty asks, in a number of different videos, you comment on how British, German, and American navies had incorrectly calibrated their magnetic influence fuses for their various torpedoes during the interwar years. This being because they based the magnetic influence of their various fuses on their testing locations. My question is, just why did this happen? I believe it should have been blindly clear to anyone that the world's magnetic field changes based on where you are in the world. Or is this just me applying 21st century scientific know-how to a 20th century problem that was not yet fully understood? I think it's kind of 50-50. When you look back at that time period, the knowledge of quite how the Earth's magnetic field worked and how it varied was not as common knowledge as it is these days. Let's just put it that way. The knowledge was there, but the impression I get from looking through reports for all 3 navies essentially comes down to partly the people who actually had the detailed knowledge to be able to put 2 and 2 together and go, hang on a minute, your sensitivities are going to change quite radically depending on how far north or south you are, were more sort of scientists and academics, i.e. not the people who are going to be involved in a top secret torpedo detonator design process. The top secret part not really helping there, because obviously if they don't know it's happening, they can't give their input. And the people who are working on it, therefore, might have a very detailed understanding about how magnetic fields interact with each other on a local level, like, say, a 10,000-ton lump of steel comes sailing past. But they are not necessarily going to have that kind of detailed knowledge of, oh, yeah, well, the Earth's magnetic field here, and thus the relative effect on the magnetic field of a ship, is this strength. But if we go really, really far north or really, really far south, it's going to be different enough to throw out our torpedo detonators. And of course, because we're talking about, a magnetic field of planetary scale versus a concentrated but relatively speaking tiny amount of ferrous metal moving through the ocean, the sensitivities involved are quite minute. And then obviously you take them out to do practical testing, and you're not necessarily going to test purely in one place, but there's a band in which things will generally work fairly well. It's just that, if you're the Germans and you're testing your torpedoes in the areas that you have access to, like the southern North Sea and the southern Baltic, you can go all over the place and, several hundred miles north and south, and it'll all still work. You then go north of the Arctic Circle at the top end of Norway, and suddenly the change is considerably more than you were ever bargaining on. And likewise for, US submarines suddenly finding themselves near the equator, and so on and so forth. So the knowledge, I think, was definitely out there, as evidenced by the fact they figured out what was going on and fixed the problems in, depending on the Navy, relatively short times. But I think it was a case of the detailed knowledge on the making of the detonator and the detailed knowledge of exactly how the Earth's field strength varied were in two slightly different sections of society, and due to the secret nature of the work, those two parts of society weren't really talking to each other until they absolutely had to. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, how thick would the armour belt have needed to have been on German battlecruisers at Jutland to give them complete protection from the 13.5-inch guns that the British battlecruisers were armed with? Well, that's a somewhat difficult question because, of course, the amount of armour that you'd need depends on what range you're being shot at. It also depends on what figures you're using for the penetration of a 13.5-inch gun and whether the fuses are working or not. But let's assume that the fuses are working and you're talking about a relatively decent strike, so near perpendicular, on the side of a German battlecruiser. That is still obviously going to be very heavily affected by range, but looking at the average range of engagement, so you're talking about the mid-teens, to have a good chance of rejecting a 13.5-inch shell outright at 15,000 yards, assuming it's hitting mostly perpendicular, you're probably looking at needing about 15 inches of armour according to the various armour penetration tables. You might get away with 14.5, maybe 14.5 to 15 inches, but that's roughly how much you would need. And of course, if you close the range further still to 12,000, 13,000 yards, or you get closed down, even that amount isn't going to save you. But for the more typical battle ranges, that probably would, which essentially means that the latest German dreadnoughts presence, the Kaisers and the Königs, even they would have to stay at, maybe 16,000 to 18,000 yards to be relatively sure of not getting penetrated by a fully working 13.5-inch shell coming in at a perpendicular angle. Now, of course, in real life, there's going to be a component of angle to that hit that's not just the angle of fall. You've also got the angle fore or aft, because the shell's not going to be fired at perfect 90 degrees, which means that your 15 inches of armour might protect you in reality down to 14,000 yards, but there is the chance of a hit at just the wrong angle actually getting through at that point. And finally, it takes 2.38 times 10 to the 17 styrofoam peanuts to fill the Grand Canyon asks, in Master and Commander, the crew most often salutes officers by kind of curling their index finger and vaguely gesturing towards their foreheads. Was that the standard, or did the officers simply accept anything that showed some effort towards saluting and acknowledging the rank? What did the regulations say, and were some officers really picky and insist on it being more by the book, if the book did say otherwise? Well, it's yet another example of why Master and Commander is such a fantastic film. It is spot on accurate for the time period it's set in. Yes, nowadays, the Royal Navy actually has, the formalised palm down, sharp salute, more reminiscent of land-based units, obviously just with palm down rather than palm out. However, that wasn't codified until the latter part of the 19th century. Back in the late 18th, early 19th century, which is the time period of Master and Commander, the Napoleonic Wars, the salute at sea was different from the salute on land. The salute on land was much more like the one we're used to today, because it is supposed to have originated, at least as a continuous basis, from the idea of lifting your visor up to, and also showing that you don't have weapons in your hands. which as a medieval reenactor, I can tell you that, yeah, basically, if you want to lift your visor up quickly and easily while wearing gauntlets to acknowledge a superior, then the kind of palm out, straight up, catching the underside of your visor with your fingertips is pretty much the quickest and easiest way of doing it. However, the point of the salute is to show, in a naval context, is essentially you're showing obedience and or respect to someone of a higher rank than yourself. And on warships, you generally aren't wearing visors or complex steel armor like that. So the show of deference instead was to initially doff your cap or your hat when everyone wore a hat. So you would reach up and you would pick up your hat and take it off. But that got shortened because obviously it was impractically long and complex for general seaborne operations, and would also put more wear and tear on your headgear, especially if you were a lower ranked officer, because you'd constantly be taking your hat on and off all day. And also, people tended to store stuff under their hats. So the salute kind of got abbreviated to, like you can see here, where essentially what you're doing is you're putting your hand to your head with your fingers curled in such a manner that you are touching the brim of your cap, acknowledging that you would remove your cap, however you're giving the gesture rather than the full action, and that is sufficient because you're still showing the adequate respect. And of course, if you don't have a nice brimmed cap like you can see here, then of course you're kind of just doing the same thing but gesturing vaguely to your head with the same kind of action, indicating that if you did have a cap, you would indicate that you were willing to doff your cap without actually having to do so. So without any specific regulation, you couldn't be overly picky about how you were saluted, other than A, were you saluted, period, and I suppose B, you could make a certain amount of if you wanted to be that kind of captain, about how enthusiastic or complete the gesture was. So, some captains might think, oh, if you've got a cap, you have to tip it, or if you don't have a cap on, then they might insist that you make the sort of a full graduated contact with your forehead and away, rather than just sort of vaguely gesturing roughly in the direction of your forehead. But it would be a lot harder to pin down anyone as long as they made an effort with any kind of charge. At worst, you might be able to get away with saying, oh, salute a bit more snappily or neatly next time, something like that. And that brings us to the end of this dry dock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Hope to see you again in another video soon as we run towards the end of 2024 and into 2025, which should be interesting, if for no other reason than, well, it'll be a new year for those of us who are using the Western calendar at least.